Thank you so much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to everyone at at Colgate University for inviting me to join you all at the Heretics Club today. And thank you to everyone tuning in virtually from wherever you are. I am extremely grateful and excited to be in community with all of you today. So I want to start today's presentation with a quote by Janae E. Bonsu, who is a part of the Black Youth Project. And it's an excerpt from her book, Black Queer Feminism as Praxis, Building an Organization and a Movement, which was included in last year's Beyond Survival, Strategy and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. Bonsu writes, healing requires an acknowledgement that there are wounds. Healing requires parties who actually want to heal. So in order to discuss healing today, and in order to understand how the Catholic Church can become an ally in the fight toward racial equity, it's important that we first address what these wounds are. More than 545,000 Americans have died during the COVID-19 pandemic. Black and Latinx citizens continue to be disproportionately affected by this pandemic, with women of color making up the majority of unemployment rates. Americans of color face higher rates of anxiety, depression, and are more likely to suffer a heart attack or stroke. Black mothers continue to receive inadequate medical care, from primary care physicians denying their pain to higher maternal mortality rates. Indigenous teens face higher rates of suicide rates and domestic abuse. And Black and Latinx transgender women are 3 times more likely to be killed. Asian American women are most likely to remain unemployed longer than 6 months. And the Asian community continues to be harassed and assaulted by racists all across the country. In 2020, we saw a rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, which were up 150% from 2019. And just last week, 6 Asian women were shot and killed in Atlanta. The United States has always encouraged such white rage and violence. European colonizers, angered by the treatment they received in their homelands, arrived on Turtle Island and violently stormed and pillaged lands that were not theirs. Colonizers raped and murdered and profited from this violence, selling enslaved African women, men, and children. The creation of new technology at the turn of the 20th century meant more reformed, sanitized systemic violence against citizens of color. Segregation, voting restrictions, redlining, prisons, detention centers. The United States of America, as of 2021, has the highest number of incarcerated people. And our inequitable healthcare system continues to affect the livelihood and dignity of countless Americans of color. White supremacy permeates every single part of our lives. Every American institution was shaped by it since this country's birth, from our healthcare system to policing, to schools, to our Catholic Church. Last year, I was working on my first book and freelancing full-time. And every month, from the moment I published my first freelance article in, I think, February or March of last year, I received a piece of hate mail every single month. White men were the authors of each of these messages, a fact easily confirmed since many of them provided full names, home cities, and some even included profile pictures. They were angry because I wrote about whiteness in the UFO community. Others were angry because I profiled Brian Massingale, a Black gay priest. Others because I criticized bishops. All called me informed about my faith, politics, and race. I read every single one of these messages and dismissed most of them as harmless, but the more violent ones I dissected word for word. I wanted to memorize each line, every single tone, every description of violence, believing that this was the way to steel myself against such rhetoric in the future. I was working on my first book and barely eating or standing up from a very poorly self-constructed desk by my living room window. And for 6 weeks from June to July, I woke up every day at 5 a.m. and wrote nonstop for 5 or 6 hours. I ignored my partner, barely speaking to him for longer than 20 minutes at a time. My anxiety was getting worse and worse as I attempted to write and process the various tragedies that were happening all around me, in our church and in our country. I zealously pored over every single COVID-19 death, every murder at the hands of armed white racists, every change in the Trump administration, every racist comment by a member of our church. By the end of the summer, I rarely left my home, and I worried whenever my partner left our apartment. Slowly, I learned that anxiety was also physical. For months at a time, I couldn't walk without back, shoulder, or chest pain. I rarely ate without a subsequent wave of nausea, and I didn't have the energy to pray or worship in any kind of way. Anxiety was a part of my vocation, my ministry, I told myself, so I continued to find new ways to fuel it. Each week, I continued to memorize each of these violent emails, and I will always remember the violence white Catholic men felt entitled to share with me, including violence against myself, my family, and the individuals who trust me with their stories. And this was not an anomaly. This is the United States of America, and this is the Catholic Church. Catholic women of color have also shared similar stories with me in private. Online and in our daily lives, from our faith leaders who denigrate social justice movements to the insurrectionists who stormed the US Capitol on January 6th, white violence permeates every part of our lived experience. Confronted by a religious media landscape seemingly unwilling to cover this very insidious aspect of white supremacy, many of us find solace in the liberatory spaces we have carved out for one another and ourselves over Twitter DMs, emails, texts, video chats, and calls. These spaces, free of white women and men, are exclusively ours, liberated from our church's white Catholicism. And in these spaces, we analyze the January 6th insurgency in real time, the Atlanta shooting last week, unsurprised at the violence and habitual white Catholic responses from the left and the right. This was not America, many proclaimed, because our country represented more than white violence, white rage. Yet this was exactly what democracy has always been. For better or worse, American democracy was born out of violence and continues to be sustained by systems that exploit, torture, and incarcerate marginalized citizens. From prisons to detention centers, to Silicon Valley, to our healthcare system, to our very church. I scrolled social media for hours that Wednesday, January 6th. Many women expressed the same question. Were congresswomen of color okay? Were staffers of color, those who cooked, cleaned, kept our leaders safe, were they okay? Generational wounds have taught us that white male rage saves the worst of its violence for people of color. So as image after image and video after video surfaced of white men with weapons, plastic handcuffs, walkie-talkies, we waited and suffered together. 5 people were killed that day. Several politicians forced to barricade themselves with maskless Republicans tested positive for COVID-19, and several congressional leaders are forever traumatized. White people in our church and country don't want to relinquish or even talk about the power that white people, white Catholics hold in this country. This means talking about white privilege, how white supremacy and racial capitalism have benefited them while simultaneously exploiting and killing communities of color. We have seen it happen in the past year alone, in the first 3 months of 2021 alone. The very colonialist sentiments that guided the early church and the so-called founders of this country are echoed in the inability of our church leaders to collectively engage with any movement, including current racial justice efforts like the Black Lives Matter movement, that is not led by white men. If one truly cares about solidarity, if you, as a white Catholic ally, truly care about Black lives, about creating a more inclusive church and nation, then one has to ask oneself, what am I willing to give up to truly center and uplift people of color? There can be no reckoning, no healing, no path forward for our church until our leaders and all white Catholics begin to acknowledge our pain and actively and consistently repair the harm and trauma that our church has caused and continues to cause Catholics of color. And one way for the church to do this is by figuring out what Catholic engagement should be with the Black Lives Matter movement and all racial justice efforts at this moment in American history. I began reporting on this movement in 2014. This was the start of my professional career, just a few years into my time at American Media. And this was a moment in my career when it felt like most of Catholic media and religious media more broadly only cared about covering our faith through a very white lens. And I was looking for stories that reflected the Bronx immigrant world that I knew. In 2013, in 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of Trayvon Martin, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the Black Lives Matter movement, These are three Black women, two of whom identify as queer, who have each been organizing for more than 10 years around issues like immigration rights, housing justice, reproductive justice, and police violence. At the time, Black Lives Matter was mostly an online campaign on Twitter and Facebook. They wanted to help empower organizers, especially younger ones, by providing them with the resources on how to get involved in the fight for racial justice. In the summer of 2014, the founders, along with more than 400 organizers from all across the United States, traveled to Ferguson, Missouri following the shooting death of Michael Brown Jr. These organizers, a majority of whom were women and men in the LGBTQ community, helped to support the marchers who were facing daily violence from law enforcement. After that summer, many of these activists returned to their respective cities and started their own local BLM chapters using the resources and knowledge they gained that summer, many of which are now part of the BLM network we see in 2021. 7 years later, the movement has grown to include chapters all across the country, providing resources on restorative justice, conflict resolution, and on how to organize. Along with marching across American streets, many organizers, including those outside of the movement, we're also using the hashtag to educate people about police brutality, abolition, immigration rights. The Black Lives Matter movement promotes inclusion, affirms and centers the experiences of Black, queer, and trans women and men, and works toward a world where all Black people are liberated and free, and by extension, all people. The more I learned about this movement, the more I reported on it, the more I began to internalize a lot of its mission. I started attending protests and interviewing activists I met back in 2014 and 2015. I met Black and Brown organizers of all age groups who were talking about issues and topics that I had yet to engage with in my professional life. I also started talking with other Black Catholics who were trying to understand what this movement was and how it could play a role in our faith. The more I read about the movement and the founders' experience, the more I began to follow and read social critics outside of the movement who embodied a lot of the tenets of the founders and their missions. I followed Black intellectuals like Zahida Kelly, Zoe Sadmudzi, Dwayne David Paul, and William C. Anderson. These thinkers were, like the founders and organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement, using social media to help their followers think more deeply about Blackness, abolition, sexuality, colorism, and capitalism. They challenged me, and I started to think more deeply about white supremacy and how every American institution had internalized it. And at a time when I was trying to understand my own faith, my own identity, the movement and the thinkers I began to learn from allowed me to begin to deconstruct much of the conditioning I have internalized since arriving in the United States. I began to think about what it means to identify as a Black immigrant with light skin. I began to think about my own privilege. I started to read and understand issues like misogyny and colorism, how it had shaped my adopted home and the motherland I left behind. I developed a framework to talk about the anti-Blackness and colorism within my own Dominican community. I began to understand how people of the same ethnic or racial group discriminated against individuals with darker skin. And it took me years to unlearn my own biases and begin to truly understand my own immigrant identity, one that was extremely privileged and also extremely oppressed. This movement, like our church, is imperfect because anything created by and centered around human beings is imperfect. But it is a challenging movement that can help push our church forward, especially at a time when our faith leaders seem to be entirely disconnected from the conversations marginalized Catholics are having. Black Lives Matter and other current social justice movements and organizations like the Sunrise Movement, the Dream Defenders, and Black Youth Project are teaching Americans, especially millennials and younger, how to organize, how to talk about oppression, how to be in solidarity at a time of social distancing and limited in-person contact. It helped me to begin to decolonize my Christianity, and most important, how to center voices who didn't get a platform in our church and in our media. And all of this conscientiousness altered my faith and relationship to our church. These movements taught me how to be Catholic, how to be a Catholic writer, how to live out what Pope Francis was preaching. I began to think more deeply about how Pope Francis was challenging us. He calls on us to, and I quote, get to know people, listen, expand the circle of ideas. Being open to the ways God was moving us meant that we were, Francis taught us, to find the courage to leave the confines of our own security and comfort, to become bruised, hurting, and dirty, as we joyfully approach the suffering other in a spirit of solidarity. The more I learned about the movement, the more I began to internalize a lot of their mission and apply it to any papal or church document I was reading. I also felt comfortable for the first time calling myself both a writer and a journalist. I often use both terms because when we tell the stories of our communities, stories historically left out of our church, we are often serving as journalists who are reporting facts to Catholic audiences for the first time. White supremacy wants us to believe this idea of complete objectivity and detachment from the stories we tell as writers, as journalists, as academics. And this movement was helping me to realize that as a writer and journalist, especially as a Catholic one, there was absolutely no way to remove myself from these stories. And in order to get people to trust me and to believe that I would honor their experiences, I needed to authentically share who I was. I needed to, as I mentioned in that Pope Francis quote from just a couple moments ago, I needed to leave the confines of my own comfort and approach the suffering other. This is what it means to go to the margins. And writing was my way to be in community with God's people, God's creation. It was a way to help people think more deeply about the humanity of the most marginalized communities in our nation and in our church. In 2018, I interviewed Alicia Garza for the article that led to my book deal. I asked Garza at the time about the movement's relationship to the Catholic Church, and she pointed to the religious leaders present in Ferguson in 2014 that supported them on the ground. She encouraged Catholic leaders to accompany the movement and welcomed any kind of dialogue from the US bishops. And that moment was a huge turning point for me. It solidified my vocation, not just again as a Catholic writer and journalist, but it also turned me into, and here I'm borrowing freely from Father James Martin, it helped me become a bridge builder for dialogue between this movement and our church. Here was confirmation that the movement welcomed Catholic involvement, especially from clergy and our bishops. It was simply on our leaders to get involved. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has remained silent collectively, while individual bishops have opined on this movement. Currently, there is no collective guidance from our leaders on how to engage with Black Lives Matter or any current social justice movement outside of the church, especially those organized by younger people. There is no relationship whatsoever between our leadership and this movement. And until there is, we will continue to see the polarization around this movement in any conversation or actions it sparks in Catholic spaces. The institutional church's unwillingness to engage with this movement is part of the church's long history with systemic oppression. I learned about the church's complicity in chattel slavery thanks to the scholarship of Shannon D. Williams. Our church was instrumental to the industry, to the industry's introduction to what became the United States in the 1500s. And Williams wrote last year that after chattel slavery was abolished, most white Catholic religious orders of men and women and seminaries continued to systematically exclude African descended people, especially US-born Black people, from admission on the basis of race well into the 20th century. Williams added that archival oral history and written record is also littered with heart-wrenching examples of white Catholics subjecting Black and brown Catholics to humiliating segregation and exclusion in white-led parishes, schools, hospitals, convents, seminaries, and neighborhoods. Throughout its history and various iterations, the USCCB has only released 4 statements on racism in the United States. Most recently, the 2018 pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love. There has been no collective apology for the church's complicity in the sin of chattel slavery, no public dialogue on police brutality, white privilege, misogyny, or abolition. And we have yet to see any collective public statement from American bishops on any current racial justice effort happening in the United States. What we have seen, however, are individual faith leaders denigrate the Black Lives Matter movement and the founders. We have seen church leaders internalize misconceptions about racial justice efforts. Last year, Washington's Bishop Daley denigrated the movement. A priest called activists in the movement maggots. And New York's Cardinal Dolan equated the oppression of Black Americans with what he perceives to be the oppression of the NYPD. For the USCCB, allyship requires bishops collectively and publicly grappling with issues that Catholics of color are demanding they grapple with, like police brutality and what it means to abolish the prison industrial complex in the United States. Faith leaders and communities play a huge role in public policy in the United States. We saw how intensely both presidential candidates last year campaigned for specific religious communities and leaders last year, in particular Christian Catholic voters. I would love to see our leaders this year figuring out how to protest during a pandemic and then using this organizing power, whatever that might look like, to challenge police departments across the country and raise funds for Black and Brown organizers, especially women who are organizing on the ground all across the country during a pandemic. We have seen Black and Brown Catholics doing anti-racism work in the church since its birth. We know there were Black and Brown Catholics present in Ferguson in 2014. And we know that, Catholics of color and many white Catholics protested in a variety of different ways all across the country following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others killed last year. I interviewed Catholics who were present in Missouri in 2014, and I've talked to Catholics this year who have marched in protest in their respective cities. And even before the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, communities of color and other marginalized groups have been challenging the church to step outside of its whiteness. Additionally, thanks to the research of Anthea Butler, Tia Noel Pratt, Father Brian Massingale, Dwayne David Paul, and many other Catholic thinkers of color, every day we are learning new ways to be in solidarity with one another and push our church forward. Last year, we saw white Catholics engaging with the movement, and many were actively and consistently raising funds for organizers and using their various platforms to urge fellow white Catholics to support people of color being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Many hosted Zoom book clubs and webinars where they discussed many of the topics I've mentioned here today. Many listened and learned from women and men of color. All of these efforts are important and they must continue, but they are not enough, and white Catholics, both lay and clergy, must not get complacent. Excuse me. Our institutional church has yet to publicly grapple with any of the issues Catholics have demanded they engage with. For this reason, our bishops have a lot of work to do if we are to believe that they truly care about liberation for all people. This begins by joining abolition work and helping Catholics to think more deeply about the public policies that affect the day-to-day lives of already vulnerable communities. Primarily white Catholic institutions, from hospitals to academic institutions to media, must also create positions in their respective fields for people of color. One of the many consequences of white supremacy, not just in the United States, but all across the world, is that the people most impacted by the evils of systemic oppression are also simultaneously internalizing the very racist norms of our oppressors. This is why I share my own unlearning of Dominican anti-Blackness and privilege. This is why we have people of color who voted for Trump. Catholic media in particular has to get better about covering our varied lived experiences and beliefs, beginning with allowing us to tell our own stories. This is, again, what it means for white Catholics to leave the confines of their own security and comfort and become bruised. Solidarity requires sacrifice, and white Catholics must embrace that and internalize that. Our faith cannot be separated from the call to justice. Catholicism demands that we get involved in the fight for liberation from wherever we are and work to push our church to become more equitable, to create a world where people of color are free and liberated to live out their full lives. Whether from institutional state violence or church silence, we deserve to be free of suffering. This is what our faith demands, and this is what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. I'd like to leave you all with 3 things that have deepened my own awareness and helped me in my own allyship. First, make sure you are reading thinkers of color. We need to familiarize ourselves more fully with the varied experience of what it means to be a person of color in this country. And if you're a student, you really challenge your teachers, professors to adopt a syllabus that isn't all white. I've mentioned a few names already: Tia Noel Pratt, Shannon D. Williams, Dwayne David Paul. And I want to highlight another thinker whose work I've been introduced to in recent months and who has been extremely crucial, especially this past week, to understand the suffering of the Asian American community in the United States, and that's Flora Tang. So she's a wonderful, wonderful writer and thinker. And additionally, a book that helped me, especially as I was writing my own book, was Freedom is a Constant Struggle: Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, excuse me. And two books that I'm currently reading that are, again, really, really helpful for me whenever I'm thinking about how to organize at this moment. These books are Mariame Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us: Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice, and Dolores S. Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness: The Challenge of Womanist God Talk. Second, excuse me. Second, follow organizers on social media and attend many of the teaching events they hold, whether it's an IG Live, a Zoom webinar, or a Twitter Q&A. One woman I have learned from immensely is Clarissa Brooks. She is a movement journalist, abolitionist, and organizer. She is unbelievably brilliant and constantly shares her scholarship and work, including what movements to support and what activists to send funds to on her Twitter. Last, figure out creative ways to be a Catholic organizer. In 2020, I was encouraged to see how Catholics were organizing, raising funds to support frontline organizers, weekly book clubs that ended with a call to action, supporting mutual aid funds, participating in protests. Follow and learn from organizations like the Sunrise Movement, the Dream Defenders, and Black Youth Project. Figure out how Catholic social teaching can be a resource for the work these organizers are doing. And remember that the struggle toward liberation for all of us is an ongoing process. My last parting words that I would like to leave you all with are from Nayyirah Waheed Salt. Decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you have been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding you freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain. Thank you all for listening today.